On a crisp autumn day, November 1, 1950, the fabric of American history was nearly torn by an event that has since faded somewhat from the public memory. The President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, the man who had authorized the use of atomic weapons to end the Second World War and who was now leading the nation through the opening stages of the Cold War, was the target of a brazen assassination attempt. This was not an attempt that took place on the grand stage of the White House, but at its temporary residence, the stately and historic Blair House in Washington, D.C. The perpetrators were not foreign spies, but two men acting on a deeply held and violently pursued political conviction, the independence of Puerto Rico. The story of that day is a dramatic tapestry woven from threads of personal conviction, political turmoil, failed uprisings, and astonishing bravery. It is a story that unfolds over mere seconds, but whose roots stretch back decades and whose consequences would echo for years to come. To truly understand the events of November 1st, we must first journey to the island of Puerto Rico itself. In the 1940s, the political landscape of the island was complex and fraught with tension. While the majority of voters had elected the Popular Democratic Party, which favored a negotiated new political status with the United States, a more radical faction held a very different vision. The Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, led by the charismatic and fervent Pedro Albizu Campos, believed that the island was suffering under what they viewed as American colonialism. They repudiated any compromise and demanded full and immediate independence. For them, the political process was insufficient. They saw armed struggle as a legitimate and necessary path to liberation. This simmering discontent erupted into open insurgency just days before the assassination attempt in Washington. On October 30, 1950, upon the orders of Pedro Albizu Campos, a series of armed revolts, known as the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party revolts, broke out across the island. Uprisings occurred in towns including Peñuelas, Mayagüez, Naranjito, Arecibo, and Ponce. The most significant and violent conflicts took place in the towns of Utuado and Jayuya, the latter being the hometown of one of the would-be assassins. The response from the Puerto Rican government, supported by the United States, was swift and overwhelming. The Puerto Rico National Guard was deployed with significant military force. In a stark demonstration of power, the U.S. Air Force was called upon, and planes strafed and even dropped 500-pound bombs on the towns of Jayuya and Utuado, leaving them badly damaged. The suppression was brutal and effective, and the revolts were quickly quashed. News of this failure traveled quickly to the Puerto Rican diaspora in New York City. There, two men, Griselio Torresola and Oscar Collazo, received the reports with a sense of fury and desperation. Torresola, a skilled and committed nationalist, was from Jayuya, and the news of his hometown's destruction would have been profoundly personal. Collazo, though less experienced in armed combat, was equally devoted to the cause. They saw the suppression of the uprisings as a brutal act of colonial oppression, and they believed a dramatic, world-shaking act was needed to thrust the plight of Puerto Rico into the international spotlight. They conceived a plan that was as audacious as it was near-suicidal. They would assassinate the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman. They knew that the White House was undergoing extensive renovations and that the President and his family were living across the street at Blair House. This, they believed, made him a more accessible target. The two men realized their chances of survival were minimal, but they were willing to become martyrs for their cause. In a New York City apartment, Torresola, an expert marksman, gave his partner a crash course in firearms. He taught Collazo how to load and handle the weapons they would use, a critical detail that would later prove fateful. Armed and resolved, they took a train from New York to Washington, D.C., to conduct reconnaissance on Blair House, observing the patterns of the guards and the layout of the property. On the morning of November 1, 1950, they put their plan into motion. President Truman was inside Blair House, taking a nap in his second-floor quarters. The day was otherwise ordinary. Outside, a complement of White House police officers and Secret Service agents stood watch, maintaining a vigilant but routine security detail. The scene was deceptively calm. Griselio Torresola approached Blair House from the west side, while Oscar Collazo approached from the east. Their plan was a simple pincer movement, designed to create confusion and overwhelm the guards. Collazo walked up behind White House police officer Donald Birdsell, who was standing on the steps of the house. Collazo raised his German-made Walther P-38 pistol and pulled the trigger, aiming for Birdsell's back. But nothing happened. In the tension of the moment, he had committed a critical error. He had failed to chamber a round. The gun did not fire. The metallic click was enough to alert Officer Birdsell, who began to turn to face the threat. Collazo, now fumbling, worked the pistol slide to chamber a round. As Birdsell turned, Collazo fired, the shot striking the officer in his right knee. The crack of the gunshot shattered the afternoon's peace, triggering an instantaneous and violent response. Secret Service agent Vincent Mraz, hearing the shots, ran through a basement corridor and burst out of a street-level door on the east side of the house. He immediately opened fire on Collazo, who was still on the entrance steps. Mraz's aim was true. A bullet struck Collazo in the chest, wounding him severely. Two other officers also fired at Collazo, and in a matter of seconds, he was subdued, falling wounded on the steps in what would later be described as the most intense gunfight in Secret Service history up to that point. But while the confrontation with Collazo was unfolding, a far more deadly drama was playing out on the west side of the property. Griselio Torresola, the expert gunman, had approached a guard booth at the west corner. There, he found White House police officer Leslie Coffelt. Taking Coffelt completely by surprise, Torresola raised his 9mm German Luger pistol and fired 4 times at point-blank range. 3 of the bullets struck Coffelt in the chest and abdomen, a 4th passed through his tunic. The attack was swift and brutal, mortally wounding the officer. Torresola, cold and efficient, then turned his attention to another officer, Joseph Downs, who was walking toward the basement entrance. Torresola shot Downs in the hip. As Downs, realizing the mortal danger, turned and struggled to get inside the house to secure the door, Torresola shot him twice more, in the back and the neck. Despite his grievous wounds, Downs managed to get into the basement and lock the door behind him, a heroic act that denied the assassin entry into Blair House itself. Now, Torresola moved to support his partner. He strode toward the shootout on the east side, where the wounded Collazo was still exchanging fire with the officers. Torresola took aim and shot the already wounded officer Donald Birdsell in his left knee. Birdsell, now shot in both legs, collapsed, effectively incapacitated. For a fleeting moment, Torresola seemed to be in control of the chaotic scene. He stood to the left of the Blair House steps, preparing to reload his weapon. At that precise moment, drawn by the commotion, President Harry S. Truman looked out of his second-floor window. He was just 31 feet away from the armed and dangerous Torresola. Secret Service agents, spotting the president in the window, shouted at him to get away, and Truman quickly heeded their warning, moving back to safety. It was at this same moment that a miracle of sheer will and courage unfolded. Despite having been shot multiple times, with injuries that would prove to be fatal, Officer Leslie Coffelt summoned his last reserves of strength. He stumbled out of his guard booth, propped himself against it for support, raised his .38 caliber service revolver, and took aim at Griselio Torresola, who was about 30 feet away. The scene was one of almost unimaginable focus and determination, a dying man, drawing on his final breath to protect his president. Coffelt fired a single, perfectly placed shot. The bullet struck Torresola 2 inches above the ear, killing him instantly. Officer Coffelt then limped back to his booth and lost consciousness. He was rushed to the hospital but died 4 hours later. The entire gunfight, from the first failed shot to the last lethal round from Coffelt's revolver, lasted less than a minute. The engagement with Torresola was over in a mere 20 seconds. In that brief, violent eruption, Griselio Torresola, the skilled shooter, had inflicted nearly all the injuries. Oscar Collazo, the novice, had only managed to land a single shot, a testament to the training and rapid response of the security detail. In the aftermath, President Truman displayed the stoicism for which he was known. He famously commented that he was not frightened by the attack, noting that as a combat veteran of the First World War, he had, in his words, already been shot at by professionals, referring to German soldiers. But the event had profound consequences. Oscar Collazo, severely wounded but alive, was taken into custody. He was later convicted in federal court for the murder of Leslie Coffelt and sentenced to death. In a remarkable act of clemency, President Truman commuted that sentence to life in prison, a decision that reflected a complex understanding of the political motivations behind the attack. Truman and his Secretary of State Dean Acheson also took a symbolic step toward healing. They asked Officer Coffelt's widow, Cressy E. Coffelt, to travel to Puerto Rico. There, she was met by crowds and leaders, and in a gesture of profound grace, she gave a speech that absolved the people of Puerto Rico from blame for the violent acts of 2 individuals. It was a powerful moment of reconciliation amidst the tragedy. The story of the aftermath extends to the families of the attackers as well. At the time of the attempt, the FBI arrested Collazo's wife, Rosa, on suspicion of conspiracy. She spent 8 months in federal prison, though she was never formally tried. Upon her release, she remained a committed nationalist, gathering 100,000 signatures in a campaign to save her husband from execution. Oscar Collazo, meanwhile, spent 29 years in prison. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter, in a further act of executive clemency, commuted his sentence to time served. Collazo was released and returned to Puerto Rico, where he continued to advocate for independence until his death in 1994. Acknowledging the deep-seated issues surrounding Puerto Rico's political status, which had been the very root of the violence, the Truman administration supported a plebiscite in 1952. This vote allowed the people of Puerto Rico to ratify a new constitution, which established the island as a free associated state, or Commonwealth, of the United States. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor, with 81.9% approving the new status. While this did not resolve the independence question to the satisfaction of nationalists like Collazo and Torresola, it represented a significant political evolution, one that was shaped, in part, by the gunfire and bloodshed outside Blair House on that November day. The attempted assassination of Harry S. Truman is therefore more than a mere footnote in history. It is a poignant and dramatic story that encapsulates a turbulent period in U.S.-Puerto Rican relations. It is a story of two men so committed to an idea of national liberation that they were willing to die for it, and in the process, they took the life of an American hero, Officer Leslie Coffelt, whose final act of valor saved a president. It is a story that forced a nation to confront the consequences of its geopolitical relationships and one that demonstrated both the fragility and the resilience of American democracy in the face of violent, ideological conflict. The echoes of those 38.5 seconds of gunfire continue to resonate, a stark reminder of the power of conviction and the high cost of political violence.